Federalism is a foundational principle of the American system, and one area where that principle is essential is in the administration of elections. Now, multiple states, including Utah, have received requests from the U.S. Department of Justice for highly detailed voter roll information. So, is this appropriate federal oversight, or is it federal overreach that could actually jeopardize election security?
So given the timing, the scale and scope of the request, how much data is being requested, and who's asking, I think there's a fear that this is less about protecting elections and more about undermining confidence in it.
On this episode, we unpack the implications of this request and why the tension between state and federal control over elections has real consequences for election security, voter privacy, and the future of self-government. This is Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're diving into a new national political fight over voting and election policy due to some requests the Trump Department of Justice has been sending out to the states to try and access some information around voter registration and election policy. To have this conversation and help us understand what's going on, I'm very excited to we'll start with our virtual studio. Welcome into our Defending Ideas discussion, Matt Germer, who is the director of the governance program for R Street Institute. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here. I love the Sutherland Institute, and I love this podcast.
Well, we're grateful for your expertise and sharing your time with us, as well as with Derek Monson, our Chief Growth Officer here at Sutherland Institute, joining us in the studio here. Derek, welcome back.
Thank you. I also love the podcast, so it's great.
You have to, because you were here, right?
You know.
Well, I'm excited to dive into this with you guys today because it's another of kind of the controversy where seems like every few months there's some big fight or big disagreement nationally over voting and election policy. And in some ways, it's kind of unfortunate that there is this heightened level of controversy over one of our most core kind of institutions of self-government. But we want to make sure we get these debates right, so we have you two guys to help us make sense of it. And Derek, I want to start with you because you wrote an op-ed recently for the Utah News-Dispatch responding to this issue of the Trump Department of Justice essentially asking states for voter information. And before we get into your arguments, you oppose what the Department of Justice is doing, but I want to ask you first, kind of what is happening? What has Utah received? What's happening at the state level? And then Matt, I'll ask for your perspective on the national front as well.
Well, I think just to quickly set a big picture context based on what you just said there about this fight over elections. I think it's important to recognize we've been fighting over elections since before we were a nation. That's one of the big fights they had at the Constitutional Conventions is how do we choose people? Is it based on population? Is it based on state boundaries? And that was all about elections, right? How we're going to self-govern, but what's the mechanisms? So this is a long-standing thing that we would have disagreements and arguments about this kind of thing. That's healthy. Specifically, what's happening today, the Department of Justice sent a letter to Utah, as it's done to many other states, and it's been reported. It wants to do to all 50 states, asking for certain information. And in Utah's letter, they're asking for processes and procedures and how we maintain our voter rolls and that the right people are on the voter rolls. And that's in furtherance of the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA as it's sometimes called, federal law. And so they're trying to enforce and implement that, make sure it's being followed. But as part of that, they requested just a list of the state's voters. And it's a little vague as to what all they mean by that. But in the expansive reading, they want all the information on Utah's voters, right? And some of that information is already public information by law. It's required to be public. So things like campaigns can get, lists of who the voters are. And there's other information like driver's license information, kind of personally identifying information that's private and confidential stuff that the state doesn't really disclose. And so the question becomes, is that what the Department of Justice is asking for? Because they haven't been clear about it. And they haven't necessarily followed up on what they really mean by that. And so it raises the specter, I guess, of states turning over private, confidential kind of identifying information on voter rolls to a federal agency. And now all registered voters' private information is housed in a single agency in the Department of Justice.
Derek, is it fair to say that, at least on the Utah level, what the Trump Department of Justice is requesting from Utah, some of it might be fine because it's process and procedure, some of it's publicly available information, but some of it actually is not fine. It's either illegal or just very unwise to share. Is that a fair way to understand what they're asking for?
I think that's right. I mean, we all care about election integrity and election security. This isn't one of those issues, maintaining voter rolls isn't one of those issues where it's like some people want it to be secure and some people want it to be free for all. It's just a question of how do we go about maintaining election security and integrity. And so the Department of Justice finding out what the processes states or like Utah has in place to make sure voter rolls are in keeping with HAVA, the Help America Vote Act. That makes a lot of sense, right? It's like a little check on what the state's doing, and those are healthy things. We always in government need little checks and make sure we're kind of keeping things above board. The question though is, why do you need a whole bunch of private voter information to figure that out? And there's a lot of questions to why and what the purpose of that is, and if it's even connected and related to implementing the Help America Vote Act versus something else that's kind of been lumped in there because they want it for some other reason.
Matt, I'm curious, what are you seeing from the national lens? Because as Derek described, what the DOJ is requesting from Utah, is it basically the same thing? Are they asking for this from all states? Or I think it's, as I understand, it's been rolling out in phases. They've asked some states. There's apparently the intent to ask all 50 states. What is happening elsewhere at the national level?
That's a great question, Nick. And forgive me, it is a little bit wonky and complicated, and I hope your audience is willing to stick with me here. But as they are listening to this podcast, they probably know what they're signing up for in some of these conversations. So as Derek pointed out, a number of states have been contacted under the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, a law passed in the early 2000s, largely in response to the 2000 election and the saga over voting in Florida. And that bill sought to modernize the election system and move things like voter registration into the 21st century, looking to create a computerized voter registration list, connect together state agencies when they interact with voters to keep the records up to date. And that includes not just, that someone's address is still accurate or that they still are a voter in the state, but also things like death records, whether or not someone may have been convicted of a felony in the years since they originally registered to vote. This is all pertinent information that needs to be brought into the voter registration database. And the Help America Vote Act, or as I'll say from here on out, HAVA, was designed to effectuate a clean maintenance of voter rolls. So a number of states, were including Utah, were contacted under the umbrella of HAVA, where the Trump DOJ is asking for more than just, as Derek pointed out, the database, although that's really, I think, at the heart of a lot of this, but also a description from them about how they are managing the database and how they are sticking to the provisions of HAVA. So that might mean information about how duplicate registrations are being identified and folks are being removed, or felons might be removed if the state takes away voting rights with a conviction. It also includes the way that new voter applications are received and what happens to that documentation. So a number of states were asked about that. But in the course of that letter as well, the very last bullet point says, now after you've described to us how you manage the voter database, send the entire voter database to us. And that has really been the area of consternation for folks concerned about election administration. Worth noting as well that not every state has received a letter under the umbrella of HAVA. A couple of states, their letter was received using a couple of other different federal voting laws. One of them, the Voting Rights Act, which dates back into the 70s to protect voting rights, particularly for minority populations around the country. Colorado received a request for records under the umbrella of the Voting Rights Act. And a couple of states have received letters under the National Voter Registration Act, sometimes called Motor Voter. This is why you might be getting an update to your voter registration at the DMV. States like Alaska and Arizona had references to the NVRA in their request. And so the interpretation from someone on my end with that kind of national lens is that the Trump DOJ, in response to An executive order the president issued in March relating to a whole variety of elections topics, but one of them was on this issue. Asked the Attorney General through the Department of Justice to investigate voter registration around the country. And so this has been an ongoing process. I think the first couple of states received their letters back in May. We've seen letters mailed out in June and then later into July. Some states have shared information without even receiving a letter. But by and large, this has been an ongoing rollout process. And as we discuss things today, I'll be interested because you may even have some questions. Listeners may have some questions running through their mind. We may not have all the answers yet, as this is still a fluid situation, and not every state has solidified their response.
Matt, I want to stay with you for a minute because you mentioned some pieces of federal law, and I want to dig in a little bit. And then, Derek, I want to ask you to kind of outline the arguments you made in your recent op-ed for Utah News Dispatch on this issue. But Matt, so as I understand it, you're saying there are three pieces of federal legislation: the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, the National Voter Registration Act, and then the Voting Rights Act. And different states that are receiving letters from the Trump DOJ are sort of getting requests under different auspices of those pieces of legislation. In your estimation, is there anything in those pieces of legislation that gives the federal government the legal ability to request the actual voter roll database from states? And is there anything in those pieces of legislation that requires states to give that to the federal government? Let's focus on that, the database question. Does the federal government have the authority to ask for this under those pieces of legislation?
So we'll take those one at a time. Under the Help America Vote Act, HAVA, there is a provision in that statute that grants the Attorney General the power to enforce many of the provisions of HAVA. Now, granted, it gives the Attorney General that ability via litigation, civil action. They can sue and require that a state comply with the law. So they're not explicitly given the permission to ask for the data, but you could infer that in order to be able to do their job, to see if there's actual compliance going on, the first step might be more of the voluntary request, which you could characterize what we're seeing here as that first step of saying, share with us what you've been doing. Presumably, if a state refused to share, I guess they could point to some provisions in HAVA to say, okay, now we're going to actually have to open a lawsuit. The NVRA, the motor voter law, that requires that states make available, I think by their terminology, for public inspection, all records concerning the implementation of the programs created under motor voter. So that's another one of those provisions. DOJ in that case is almost like the public, looking for public inspection of compliance with that law. The Voting Rights Act also requires, I think, election records to be kept for at least 2 years following an election for the purpose of DOJ compliance. So each of these have some kind of hook. None of them are directly on point. And as a lawyer myself, that always makes me excited for the arguments to come, because that always gives that gray area for both sides to be able to make their argument. But at some level, I think it's fair to say these are federal laws, and the DOJ, at least structurally, is kind of the right entity to begin an inquiry on enforcement of these laws. I think at the heart of so much of this, and we'll probably dig into this as we keep going, but at the heart of so much of this entire story matters because it's about concerns with trust and transparency and the potential for politicization. The stated goal is enforcing election laws, and we're seeing the use of those election laws as the rationale for these letters. But many people out there are worried that it's really just a way to build a case against states. You could even think of it perhaps as a fishing expedition, that some states are either not doing enough to prevent fraud or heaven forfend, they may even be trying to promote it in some way. And that's all based upon, the Trump DOJ's definition of what fraud is, which I think folks might have some disagreements with as well. So given the timing, the scale and scope of the request, how much data is being requested, and who's asking, I think there's a fear that this is less about protecting elections and more about undermining confidence in it.
Derek, what I interpret from what Matt just said is sort of on the legal side, it's kind of murky at best. And you obviously make some arguments in your op-ed that we'll, of course, link to in the show notes about the legal side of it. So I wonder if you can kind of give a response that if states or if we as voters are trying to understand, Is there a good legal or constitutional basis for what the Trump DOJ is doing? And then also maybe talk about the policy implications, because you also talk a lot about, from a just good election governance and security standpoint, there are some concerns with this approach.
Well, the constitutional side of the legal question is an interesting one, because you look into the U.S. Constitution, where it talks about elections. It gives states the authority to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections, and then it gives Congress the ability to augment those things. That's not the direct quote, but like to change those through legislation through Congress. And so it's this very fascinating, actually, if you care about this kind of thing, a federalism setup, right? That states have certain authority, Congress has certain authority. They kind of overlap, and where are those lines drawn? And what the Department of Justice is doing, in some sense, is going to help define some of those boundaries, probably. So this is what our system is designed to do. It's designed to empower different levels of government, be it executive versus legislative, or in this case, federal versus states, and then each of them pursuing their own interests. If they kind of stand for their institution, then we check and balance each other, and we figure out how to actually do this stuff. So that just highlights, even at the constitutional level, it's not cut and dry, right? That they don't have the constitutional authority to do this. I've read some legal analysis saying that when states have been taken to court over these kinds of things about disclosing certain private information, that the courts have tended to say, no, the law protects the states and not with disclosing that. So there's something. The other element on the legal side is there's a federal law called the Federal Privacy Act of 1974 that says that if any federal agency is going to go out and gather information on U.S. citizens, even if it's already public information, it's something that you could just go get yourself, that they have to go through a kind of a disclosure process that invites comment and debate about what they're doing and why. That hasn't happened in this case. And so, it's this interesting kind of, contradiction or ironic kind of situation where the Department of Justice is saying we're trying to enforce federal law and we're going around a different federal law to do that. But that's the other legal side of this, is are they following the proper processes that are really there just to protect us? One of the things I think that a lot of people will resonate with, whatever they think about election security and the Department of Justice, is, do you want a lot of your private identifying information being rounded up by the federal government into a central database? And I think a lot of people would say no, or they want to at least know that's happening, and be able to push back on it. And again, some of that stuff, it's come out through media reporting, but not through the legal processes that it was intended to have to follow. So that's just some on the legal side. On the policy side of it, again, this is really about election integrity and election security, which we all want to have. And the question is about how do we do it? And, talking about the federalist kind of structure that we have, because decision-making authority and, in a lot of cases, information around elections is dispersed among various levels of government, federal, state, local, and even for the people themselves. You handle your ballot yourself, and that's where election security starts, and maybe is strongest as long as it's in your hand, right? Because of that, it becomes really, really challenging to execute mass voter fraud. You'd have to, to really say on a national election, you'd have to be infiltrating federal, state, and local governments almost simultaneously at some level in order to pull this off. And so lo and behold, we have elections every year, a lot of them every year, be they off-year elections at the local level or even year elections at the federal and state level. And you just don't have many instances of concrete, kind of verified voter fraud that is changing any election outcome. And that is because it is so complicated to do. What the Department of Justice is doing in asking for the voter roll information is kind of pushing in the other direction by taking all that information that would be at 50 state databases, as it were, and trying to pull it all into a single federal database. And if I'm someone trying to jimmy an election somehow, that's a gift, right? I only have to go to one database and hack it. And by the way, right, we have a history of the federal government getting hacked. It's not like it's the perfectly secure system. In some high-profile instances, a lot of negative things have happened because of hacking of the federal government. So, it in that sense, takes a step that would undermine election integrity or the integrity of voter information as part of our election security system. And I think is a step in the wrong direction when it comes to the policy considerations.
Matt, how do you think about the security aspect of this, or kind of the good governance and election policy aspect of this? So acknowledging the legal debate is super interesting. I assume we will see lawsuits from states, move forward on this issue. And my guess is, Matt, you would know more, obviously, that at some point we'll see this before the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll obviously see how that all plays out. But just on the policy merits of this, from an election security standpoint, what I interpret from Derek saying is that the dispersed nature of our system is actually an asset. We have 50 states administering elections. We have hundreds or thousands of county and local governments involved in various aspects of election administration. As Derek says, the voters themselves. And so there's been this message at times that I hear of, you have this fragmented system and every state kind of doing things their own way. That the argument is that actually helps protect against widespread fraud. Is that compelling to you? And if so, is the Trump DOJ kind of doing something, as Derek argues, that ultimately would not strengthen and might actually weaken election security in the long run?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, and it's something I entirely agree with. And in so many different arenas, not just elections, but this is a fantastic example of it. There is a real security benefit to distributing information and systems across the huge geography that we have, and also distinct policy landscapes across the country. We have so many idioms and cliches even that we fall back on, like don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? Or think about your investment portfolio, how you want to diversify your assets in case something were to happen to one of them. As far as our election administration is concerned, that's largely how we are at present. We not only have 50 states and a variety of territories, but we've got differences in election administration at the county or even municipal level, depending on the construction of the state. And that's a benefit. It does come at trade-offs. I think as a conservative, I recognize that almost all public policy issues are really just a battle between trade-offs. And in this case, it is logistically difficult to move from one state to another and re-register when you reach the new state and make sure you know where to go to vote and that your old information is removed from the old state. Those are the kind of things that can be resolved with a federalized system. But on the other side of that, the trade-off that we are willing to make as someone who appreciates that it's done at the local level is that it's, as Derek pointed out, very difficult to hack and create widespread nationwide voter fraud. Whereas if we had a centralized system, it would be a much more targeted environment. We use not only all these different state databases like we're talking about today, but how to actually vote varies across the country. We have different voting machines. In states like Utah, folks are familiar how they vote from home. Well, that's not the case in all the rest of the states. And the actual processes, machinery, programs, software, all of that varies either state by state or even county by county. And yes, that creates a bit of a tension or conflict sometimes when those things don't align, but it comes with the benefit of it being difficult to hack. Now, I suppose that said, there are some steps that I think states should be looking to help streamline election administration, and you don't have to think of them as federalizing elections. We've had a debate over the last few years over the sharing of this exact kind of information, state voter registration information between states. Organizations like ERIC that have come up in places like Utah over the last couple of years are voluntary data sharing arrangements between the states so that we can try to keep our voter rolls clean without having a centralized repository, that the federal government oversees to view all of this. I suppose one final thing I'll point out in this conversation of federalizing elections or not, and whether or not this is taking a step in that direction, I think there's a real challenge folks should recognize when it comes to this entire discussion, which is the federal government is not on the ballot in every election either. So even if we're looking at all the different trade-offs about whether or not it makes sense to streamline our elections administration, a good chunk of our elections around the country don't feature federal candidates at all. We really only see them in the even-numbered years for president, Congress, Senate. But those city council races, those county level races, everything from dog catcher to drainage districts, and all the rest around the country are all local. And it makes sense that our locals are going to need to be masters of their own election administration and infrastructure in order to conduct those kinds of elections as well.
I'll just say as a fun aside, the dog catcher analogy, I've heard, I mean, that's kind of the trope, right? Like, oh, you're a local dog catcher. And as a separate, different podcast where they were talking about election policy, somebody made the comment, I hear that all the time. I've never voted for a dog catcher. I don't know what people are talking about. Just kind of, I mean, the point is well taken, but it always kind of makes me chuckle that I didn't know that was a constitutionally appointed office I could choose as a voter who gets to catch stray animals in my neighborhood. But again, to your point, Matt, there's this local component that when that intersects with the state, with the federal government, kind of this patchwork system is actually a plus. And Derek, I want to ask you sort of a two-part. One, if there's anything you want to respond to from what Matt said on sort of that system, or anything he said that prompts like, yeah, people need to understand this when we're debating election policy. And then I have a bigger kind of institutional trust question for you, but I'll ask you to respond to the other part first.
Well, I think highlighting the need for local election officials to have this expertise, there's some that Matt said. I think that's valuable in recognizing that, whatever your concerns may be about elections, and there have been, concerns raised in recent years, in particular, and I think they pre-existed that, but they become more vocal perhaps and more strident. I guess the question I'd raise with that is, what are you trying to create? Are you trying to create a system where the folks that you seemingly don't trust, those local election officials, are out of the picture? And then what? You want the people thousands of miles away in a state or a federal capital counting all the votes where you can't hold them to account because you can't even be there, whereas you can actually go down to your local county clerk and kind of observe the system happen. So I think maybe we need to. What's highlighted by Matt's comments, we need to think about what we actually want, not just what we have concern about, because otherwise we could actually adopt something that's much more terrible than we have now, simply out of a knee-jerk kind of but this isn't great, and therefore I just want to get rid of it, right? And you're not really thinking about what you want to replace it with. I guess that's an important thing. And then, Romy, the second question.
Yeah, it was from an institutional trust standpoint, which is something we talk a lot about here at Sutherland. We've talked about it often on the show. And the perception that I have, just kind of understand this issue from sort of just a regular voter standpoint, is that it seems that if you try and drill down to why there is so much concern in recent years about fraud and election security, and obviously we know controversies around the 2020 election and all the claims that were incorrect about that and everything. But what I'm curious about is, typically, and I think you've talked about this before on the show and maybe in some other writings, that when people do have elevated concerns about fraud, it correlates with when their preferred outcomes don't take place in an election. So it's like, well, if my guy lost, what the heck? Like, there's got to be something going on. That was obviously true in 2020. But at least those concerns, again, as we've talked about at length, not good evidence for those concerns. But with this last election, President Trump obviously won the election. He didn't win in 2020, he won in 2024. Republicans have control over both chambers of Congress. And so part of me is like, what? They won, but yet why is there still this outside concern over fraud? It's like, well, if quote unquote my team won, I'm trying to understand where this concern is coming from, and if it's just a lack of institutional trust, that are people just in partisan buckets now, that, well, if you don't trust your state, you need the federal administration you like to come in and fix them. Is that too simplistic, or help us understand what's going on?
Yeah, I think it comes from a place that's been long building, which is, this was a dynamic that was explored when Trump first kind of started rising in profile in 2016. This disaffected America kind of, and that's not the first time that's been examined, but maybe Trump's campaign was maybe the fullest embodiment of it, representing the views of that sector of the United States. And that group of Americans tends to have less trust in the institutions, right? And honestly, for good reason. When you look at some of what's happened to some of them in their lives, like in the Rust Belt areas, places where jobs have gone away and other things like deaths of despair have taken their place, and nobody seems to be caring or doing anything about that. But they're doing things about problems they care about. And so what message does that send? And also, you do that for long enough. You go through that for long enough. And it's easy to see why people would start to say, oh, this whole system is rigged against me. And that includes the elections, because that's how the people who are rigged against me are getting into office, into power. So, I mean, there's a rationale to it, I guess is what I'm saying. And you can understand maybe going through those experiences where some of them might be coming from. And so there's a trust issue going on there. And we do need to address that because in elections, I mean, this may be a political truism that perception is reality, but in elections, in institutions, the perception can generate whether you trust it or not. And so it's a real important thing. It's not just this thing we acknowledge is there, but we can't do anything about. We have to do something about it if you're talking about institutional trust. And so it's worth looking at our election systems and asking, are we doing everything we can reasonably to maintain election integrity? Now, we have other priorities. Are we also doing everything we can to make sure that people who have the right to vote can vote? You know, that we're not just putting barriers in the way or hurdles just because. And so asking those questions about election security will help us address, I think, over time in particular, the perception questions. And some of this is just the political pendulum going back and forth. You know, we went through a period up till about, say, 2020, where it was defined by, I think, expansive access to voting. And that was kind of the priority. And at least that oversimplifies it, but I think that was kind of the general direction. Things with vote by mail, for instance, early voting, all these things that have happened in the last generation or so. And now maybe the pendulum is kind of looking back the other way a little bit, saying, okay, did we go too far with that? Do we need to tighten things up a little bit? Utah's recent reform in House Bill 300 that was enacted during the last legislative session is an example, of pulling some of those things back. And now, I actually think that's a bad policy move, but I can also understand, where it might be coming from, and see that sometimes you don't get what you want, right? So I wouldn't have preferred to do everything that was in that law, but that's how it goes sometimes.
Matt, what's your take on kind of the big picture stuff that Derek's outlining? And I'll let you respond to that, and then I just want to flag, I do want to ask you about some of these similar debates that happened during the Biden administration. So first, what's your big picture response? Then I'll get into my other policy question.
Yeah, I think Derek really hit it when it comes to explanations around issues of trust. And I think this particular issue around asking for all this voter data shines a spotlight on our trust gap and our trust problems really on both sides of the aisle. As Derek pointed out, there's a substantial distrust in institutions. I think we've seen it, as someone who identifies on the right myself. I feel like I see it in my own people. Maybe it's because that's kind of just the pond I'm used to swimming in. But we know that things like distrust in elections dates back decades within the GOP. I mean, you can go back to 1960s presidential election and Republicans concerned that Nixon should have won, but Kennedy only won due to election fraud in Chicago or Texas. And that same narrative carrying through for decades. I grew up in blue California, although I guess it wasn't quite as blue when I was growing up, but grew up in blue California, spent my career in the blue Pacific Northwest as a blue state Republican. And we often heard at our kind of county party meetings and activities, Republicans would win if only Democrats didn't cheat. I hate to break it to my fellow partisans from back in the day that the numbers just didn't add up in places like Washington State, but that has been in the water for a very long time. And I think in large part, Trump's anti-establishment messages just resonated with folks that were ready to lean into it. On the other side of this, I think this conversation also points to issues of distrust on the left. As Derek pointed out, the Privacy Act from the 1970s may be relevant to this issue. The DOJ didn't ask for the data properly. They needed a notice and comment period and other processes to follow federal law. But I wouldn't hold my breath thinking that if DOJ had followed all of the provisions of the Privacy Act, that suddenly Democrats would be okay with these requests. I think they would still have a problem with the collection of this data. And I think that means that the lack of following the Privacy Act might be a problem, but it isn't the problem. It's not the fundamental element of this. I think a lot of it has to do with just generally folks not feeling trust in the Trump administration, in their motives, and in their goals, and you could say even in their processes. If you look back toward earlier to this year, when the Department of Government Efficiency, DOJ, was going and combing through federal databases and trying to draw together insights to improve government efficiency, or under the banner of improving government efficiency, and surmising that maybe there were fraudulent Social Security payments because of the age of someone listed in the database. And as it turns out, it was just their lack of familiarity with the database, and it led to negative downstream consequences. The same kind of thing can happen here in the request for all of this data. And so all of it's to say, I think the real heart of so much of this is just a lack of trust on the right for institutions broadly, and a lack of trust on the left for the Trump administration. And we're seeing those two cultural trends kind of at loggerheads on this. And it's a shame, because I really do think that so many Americans, if you were to just kind of sit down with them one-on-one and ask, they would want their elections to be secure. They want the voting databases to be up to date. They want the government to follow the law, and they want those laws to be enforced. And on some level, the Trump administration's requests are in that spirit. But it just keeping the conversation cabined to those four walls loses all of the other context at play at the culture at large, and at play in our politics in the present.
Matt, I want to ask you, I want to conclude in a minute on kind of some kind of consensus vision for what's next, like what should happen from both of you guys. But Matt, I want to pinpoint something you said as far as the lack of institutional trust, depending on kind of where you sit in terms of partisan affiliation. And hearing this stuff in the news and reading Derek's piece and hearing this discussion, I kept thinking about, during the Biden administration, the proposal for H.R. 1, which, Matt, you'll remember some of the details much better, but it was a pretty sweeping piece of potential legislation to kind of federalize elections and do all these things. And I remember a speech that President Biden gave when he was sort of selling this, that it seemed, just as a normal voter, I guess, hearing this, it seemed similar, though very different in degree and scope, from some of the kinds of things that President Trump was saying. In that, I remember President Biden was asked a press question about the proposal, said, something about the lines of, is this, what does this say about the security of elections? And his response was something along the lines of, well, elections moving forward, how secure and trustworthy they are will depend on how much of this bill we can get passed. That's a paraphrasing of what he said. I remember thinking, again, very different in scope and degree and kind, but if both sides, depending on the partisan circumstance, are kind of saying that, well, it's not trustworthy unless the things that I want to happen can happen, that seems really concerning to me. And so I've kind of taken the view as a conservative federalist kind of approach of, I just would prefer the federal government not getting really deep in these issues. In general, I like when states get to do things, and this seems to be one where deferring a little bit more to states rather than the federal government, regardless of who's in office, would make sense. But kind of rein me in where needed for that. Is that the right way to think about this? If I just don't trust the federal government, leave it up to states and local, or is that too much of an oversimplification?
I think your instincts are on point here. I think there is a tendency at this point for both parties to try to paint their president as the one man who can fix all of our country's problems. And unless we give him the power that he needs to enact his agenda, we can't trust any of our government institutions from the highest to the lowest levels. On the election side, as you point out, you're right. Democrats put forward H.R. 1, and I think they called it the For the People Act. It did all sorts of stuff. It was a very large bill, including things related to campaign finance, which are not as pertinent here to election administration specifically. But it also included, I think, nationwide rules about voter registration, about either letting folks register to vote online or register to vote the same day as the election, which is still a divided question across the country, and it has a number of mechanical impacts that vary based on where you are. Vote by mail states that allow for same day registration are very different than vote in person states when it comes to election administration. And it had a whole bunch of additional provisions about how many days of early voting you need and how voting by mail works. And so many of these ideas were brought forward to nationalize and standardize. And I look back and think if we had had that in place during COVID, it might have been quite difficult to actually get all of our localities across the country in shape for an election amidst a pandemic. And I'm grateful for the local control that we had because that actually increased flexibility in response to the pandemic. And so, again, looking toward the benefits of federalism, I think that kind of emergency response is a great example. And similarly, we can even look back to 2024 and the state I live in these days, North Carolina. We were suffering from the consequences of Hurricane Helene in the western part of our state, and places in Georgia and Tennessee also had some impact as well. And having that local control and flexibility means you have folks on the ground who live in that community, who are there to respond to the crisis, who can make the changes they need to make and ensure that all Americans get their access to vote. So there really are consequential, tangible benefits to Americans in having this distributed, diverse federalist system. And I think it gets lost because our politics has become so centralized. We define whether or not our party is winning and losing, not by looking at our city council, not by looking even at voter registration numbers or how many of your friends and family you have aligned with you on your political views. We define our feelings on our politics based on who's in the White House. And including for Utah and so many of the states I mentioned I grew up in, I have very little control over who's in the White House. It's largely defined by a handful of states that decide the election each 4 years, and yet we wrap up so much of our political well-being into that person, and I think it's a mistake. And I would encourage everyone who gets a chance to dig into politics to dig in locally, because that's really what matters.
I want to ask you each kind of my final question with the caveat that if there's anything, just kind of this burning thought in your mind, like I need to make sure the audience understands this, lead with that. But the final question, Matt, I'll start with you, and then Derek, give you the kind of the last word, is what should happen moving forward? And here's how to frame the question for you, Matt. If the Trump administration asked you, said, hey, we care about voter security, we care about accurate voter rolls, we want states to do the right thing, what is the proper and appropriate way for the federal government to act in pursuit of that objective within the law and with an eye toward good election policy? And I'm going to ask a version of that for state leaders to you, Derek. So, and feel free to cross over on the levels, but I just thought, Matt, President Trump walks into your office and says, Matt, you're great. Just tell me what to do. What do I do?
Yeah, wow, that's a huge question. And I don't know that we have another 40 minutes to spend delving into all of my ideas. So I'll keep it as short as I can. One, I do think a lot of our crisis when it comes to election administration around the country truly is one of leadership. Having leaders in charge who express to the people that, I have control over this situation. Largely, American elections can and should be trusted. But we're always in this moment for continuous improvement. I know the state of Utah has done a fantastic job of leaning into that spirit of continuous improvement. We are good, but we can get better. And when it comes to these things like voter registration lists, we should be encouraging states on their own accord to band together to share this information. Organizations, even if it's not specifically ERIC and that organization that did that, similar type of organization that allows for hopefully all 50 states to get together to be able to identify duplicates in their system and keep things up to date would be great. We need more communication between state agencies when it comes to updating addresses and the like. And largely at the heart of so much of where my spirit is on election administration is keeping the voter at the center of the process, really from a customer service mindset. Recognizing that this is one of those few places where just about every American has a direct interaction, not just with their kind of federal candidates, but with their local government. So many of us, we drive the roads, we send our kids to the schools, but we don't think of that as being a civic process in quite the same way as our elections are. And so we need to treat them with a certain amount of additional attention and customer service-oriented mindset so that our taxpayers who are so frustrated by increases in taxes or feeling like they're not getting their money's worth really do feel like they're being put at the center of the conversation. So yeah, happy to talk about this, maybe an additional follow-up, but there's a big opportunity for leadership. I think we've got a vacuum in that space, and whoever can step in and fill it will be doing this whole country a service.
Derek, what's the opportunity for folks at the state level? What would you recommend?
Well, so I was on a news interview on my op-ed today, and one of the radio hosts said, I'm an attorney, and when the Department of Justice comes knocking, you comply, right? That's what you do. And I think I would advise state leaders on this, whether it be Utah or any other state, that may be the impulse that we have. Hey, the Department of Justice is serious. But what's equally serious is states have a unique role and authority over elections. And it's not simply to do what the federal government tells them to do. While we talked earlier that there's kind of some blurred lines there, what that means is there's going to be some clear state grounds to stand on one side of those lines. And so I would advise state lawmakers to stand up for their authority as the election officials that are primary in the boundaries of the state. And you don't have to simply do something because the federal government tells you to do it or asks you to do it in this case. If you think it's wrong, you can say no because you are an equally independent jurisdiction to the federal government with its own constitution. And again, where the federal constitution is not clear on this, you have grounds to say what you think is right. And then, of course, it may go to the courts, right? And things may get ironed out that way. But that's worth pursuing, figuring out where these lines are and representing a variety of perspectives in these policy decisions. And then as they wind their way through the courts to figure out what the law really is and is a valuable exercise in maintaining the trust and integrity of our elections, because it's really federalism that means election integrity. There's a lot of things in place that help protect it, but fundamentally, it's the structure of our system that protects us from voter fraud.
Well, we will leave it there. There's a lot more to talk about. We'll have to have you guys back and continue to discuss, as election policy is just one of the top issues of our modern political era. So the conversation continues. Again, thank you to Derek Monson of Sutherland Institute.
Glad to be here.
And Matt Germer of the R Street Institute. Thank you both for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you so much.
Well, we're going to take a final break before we leave you all some talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. What we're seeing unfold on this issue is more than just a debate over data. I think it's actually a deeper question about who holds the authority to safeguard our elections. If we care about preserving the American system of self-government, then we should also care deeply about maintaining clear constitutional boundaries between federal and state power. That includes protecting the principle that states have an essential responsibility for administering elections. At the same time, we should always take election security seriously and seek to improve our policies, but without compromising privacy, security, or public trust in the process. So here's my takeaway for each of us today. Let's not lose sight of the fact that election integrity and federalism actually go hand in hand. A decentralized system where the states serve as stewards of the vote is not a flaw, it's actually a feature. And it's an idea that's worth defending. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Make sure to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or the friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.